Hi everyone. Hi Dr. Martin. How are you? Are you there?
I am
Hi.
here.
Yes,
Hi.
thank you very much for you are online right now. You are in the evening, right? Around 9:30 or 10:30 p.m.
8:30. Yeah.
8:30. Okay, so I hope it's not too late to you right now. We are in the morning time. As you can see, some people have the breakfast from McDonald's. And this is the IPCS International Program of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development. And we are also the National Taiwan. Can you hear me?
Sorry. Yeah, it was just there's a lot of background noise, so it's a little hard to hear sometimes.
Okay.
But I can hear you okay. I think there's some noise coming from someone else on here too.
Yes.
Oh, it went away.
Okay. And because we are inviting for the campus visit, but because you are in America, so it's kind of the virtual campus visit. And we used to invite the scholars for the campus visit if they can be in Taiwan, will be in the seminar time. A lot of the faculty members will be able to join, but this is very special. You are in the morning, and we arrange some other time. So right now we have some students here, and some faculty members will be online, and then we will take a record for those who may not be able to join, and then can see our conversations and can know you more, and we will have the decision later on, maybe next week. It's okay?
Okay, sounds great.
Yes. And then I would like to introduce some of the faculty members in here, and then some has been online up to now, and then maybe after that we can start the conversation. We also had some international students over here, and then PhD and master students. Hamadu, do you want to say something?
Hello, my name is Karu Komatsu. I'm from Japan. I joined IPCS last year.
Okay.
Okay. Nice to meet you.
Yes, and then Marina, your turn.
Hello. Good morning here in Taiwan. My name is Mariana. I'm from the Philippines, and I'm a second-year master's student.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm also from the Philippines, and I'm also a second-year master's student.
Thank you.
I'm a PhD student at IPCS.
Okay. And then
Hi, hello, I'm Derek Lee. I'm the PhD student of IPCS. This is the third grade right now, and of course I'm from here. Thank you.
Okay. Something?
I'm just one of the candidates next week, so I'm just glad to see you and look how it goes down. Thank you.
Okay. And then
Hello, I'm joining the faculty of Ming Wheeler from Department of Atmospheric Science.
all right.
Nice to see you.
And then we also have the Professor Zhou Shuqin is online right now. Does Professor Zhou want to say something?
What was that?
Professor Zhou, you want to say something? Okay, ma. Has mute. Okay, maybe we have the technical problems. We will let everyone speak out online later on. It's okay for you?
Yes.
Yeah. And then we will have the kind of the virtual campus visit for you today. And then the schedule will be 1 hour for the job talk. So you can tell us about your research and about your teaching ideas, many things to our students and then faculty members. And for 1 hour, and then students will leave. And then we will have the conversation with the faculty members with you, kind of the interview. And that will be another 1 hour. So about our 11:30 time, 10:30 time, you will invited to discuss with the students. Only you and among of the students together. And then we will collect students' opinions about what they feel, and then how about their opinions about all candidates to us before we make a final decision. I hope you understand the procedures today. So we'll keep you about the 2.5 hours. I hope you will be fine. And then we have another faculty member coming. Say something. JP. Okay, JP Chen from the Atmosphere Science Department. And then we have some other faculty members coming up online now, Professor Zhuang from the Geography and then Geography, and then Professor Zhang from the Building and Planning, also from NTU. And then Professor Huang Zhuoyi, also online right now from Geography Department. So we save the time, so right now floor is all on you, and then you can tell us your ideas about your teaching and then today your speech. Thank you very much. So we say thank you. Your time.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, just let me know, say something if you can't hear me at any point, because when I'm presenting, I can't see any of the cameras at the same time. So what I'm going to be doing in my talk today is it's my research in this first part. So if you have questions about my teaching afterwards, I'm happy to speak to that, or I can talk about it when I meet with just the students or just the faculty members too. So thank you so much for inviting me here to speak today, and special thanks to everyone who helped coordinate this virtual visit, particularly given the challenges of technology and the time zones. So my name is Andrea Marston, and I'm an environmental geographer and current assistant professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And my presentation today is mostly about a project that I'm in the process of finishing, which is about mining and indigenous politics in Bolivia. Towards the end of the talk, I'll also speak briefly about the project that I'm just beginning, which examines urban water governance and mining in the context of climate change and the emerging green economy. So the research I'm presenting today is animated by a single question. Why does resource extraction continue even when it is environmentally and socially harmful, even when it fundamentally contradicts official state policies, and even when it's not economically viable? I will argue that resource extraction continues because of historically territorialized resource nationalism, and because of the daily reproduction of nationalist identities through labor processes. So what this means in the context I work in Bolivia, is that the subterranean has been constructed as a fundamentally nationalist space, and this nationalism presupposes particular identities: working class, masculine, and mestizo, which means mixed race, and I'll talk about that more later. Today's miners attempt to occupy these nationalist identities, and in so doing, they perpetuate economic and political formations that appear completely mismatched with contemporary realities. So I'll explain what I mean by all this over the course of my talk, but for now, just know that I'm going to be walking you through a story that's very multi-scalar. This story connects local labor processes underground to Bolivia's national political sphere and even to global geopolitics. But first, this is just an outline of where we're going. I'm going to start off by discussing the context in which I work, my conceptual approach, and my methodology. Second, I'll work through my findings, and this is mostly ethnographic and historical evidence drawn from highland Bolivia, in a town where thousands of independent indigenous miners continue to work in a tin mine that was officially shut down in the 1980s. Third and finally, I'll elaborate on my argument and discuss how I'm developing it into a new project. And so without further ado, this is part one, introduction. I work with small-scale miners known in Bolivia as mining cooperatives, although as you'll see today, there's nothing particularly cooperative about them. I think about mining cooperatives in relation to the multiply constituted political left in Latin America. In the early 2000s, Latin America was awash in what's been called a pink tide, which refers to the prevalence of elected officials proclaiming themselves to be some combination of environmentalist, socialist, and pro-indigenous. But a central tension ran through all these administrations. Despite declarations of support for sustainable development, state-controlled resource extraction was deepening across the region. Bolivia was and remains the paradigmatic example of this tension. In Bolivia, indigenous values have been discursively absorbed into the state and regurgitated in pro-extractivist propaganda, as you can see in this mural, which features a picture of a helmeted miner and the phrase vivir bien, which means live well. And this phrase vivir bien is borrowed from the indigenous Aymara concept summa camana, which is meant to describe development that is measured not by continuous economic growth, but by the attainment of sustainable, healthy lives for all. So industrial mining to live well, which is what this mural says, is completely at odds with environmentalist interpretations of vivir bien or summa camana, since it implies that mining is environmentally and economically sustainable, which it certainly is not. In ways similar to that mural, cooperative miners embody the tension between environmental sustainability and resource extraction. As primarily indigenous miners, they have been involved in pushing for both sustainable development and the exploitation of non-renewable resources. So throughout my work, I take seriously a founding principle of heterodox political economy. Economies are shaped by people who are in turn shaped by their labors or relations of production. So in other words, we should be able to speak to the endurance of resource extraction in Bolivia by examining the everyday labors of people on, or in this case, in the ground. So this is why I focus my work on mining cooperatives. By studying the formation of cooperative miners through their social and environmental relations of production, I'm extending several conceptual themes within a broad world of sustainability studies. First, I am part of a growing group of scholars thinking about what's called resource materiality. In a general way, these scholars are asking how nature's physical and chemical properties influence social processes. Although there are many internal debates within this group, there's a fundamental agreement that nature shapes society, not just the other way around. Second, and closely connected to the question of resource materiality, is the question of how to think about natures and environments in 3 dimensions. In geography, this is often discussed as the production of vertical or volumetric space, but I have recently been thinking about it as a 3D environment. Approaching nature in 3 dimensions involves considering how it varies with depth and height, as well as longitude and latitude. It also involves attention to constitutive interactions across different natures, such as between geological, hydrological, biological, and atmospheric natures. Third, there is a long and ongoing discussion within environmental studies about how nature shapes human bodies and identities. I contribute to this conversation by connecting it to the first 2 points. I argue that geological materiality, so that's the first point, and 3-dimensional environments, the second point, fundamentally shape senses of identity, and particularly how society comes to be divided along lines of race, gender, and class. So now I'm going to give you some brief context about Bolivia, which is somewhat an unusual country. Since the adoption of a new constitution in 2009, Bolivia has been officially considered a plurinational state rather than a regular nation state. This transformation describes a reorganized relationship between the state and Bolivia's indigenous nations, which together make up the majority of the country. Rather than a recognition of indigenous peoples by the state, the idea is that the plurinational state is itself indigenized. The indigenization of the Bolivian state was embodied in its former leader, President Evo Morales, who was in power from 2006 to 2019. So this is him, and this is a picture of his second inauguration in 2010, which took place at Tiwanaku, which are the oldest set of indigenous ruins in the country. Morales was Latin America's first indigenous identifying president. Since his initial rise to power, Bolivia has been heralded as a place of hope for indigenous and environmentally sustainable futures. The new constitution recognizes Pachamama, or Earth Mother, and calls for politics to be guided by the principle of harmony with nature and defense of biodiversity. But as I hinted earlier, Morales' government was neither particularly green nor particularly pro-indigenous. When he came to power, resource extraction increased dramatically in a country already known for its resource-dependent economy. Natural gas and mining, which included silver, tin, gold, zinc, and lithium, underwrote all of Morales' social programming for 14 years. Most people write about Bolivian plurinationalism as a horizontal reorganization of relationships between the state and indigenous territories. But I argue that the vertical space of the underground is critical to interrogating the limits of plurinationalism. These limits trace the border between soil and subsoil, below which indigenous politics are overridden by extractive economics. Now, I work with cooperative miners, not indigenous farmers, but the truth is that they're often the same people. Indeed, cooperative miners call themselves agromineros, which means agricultural miners, to highlight their connections to both agrarian and extractive economies. But before I go any further, I need to make it very clear that these are not actually cooperatives in the form you're probably imagining. They are more like guilds or collections of independent workers who have banded together to gain legal access to mining concessions. What this means is that profits are not shared across cooperatives, which means that one member might grow wealthy while another works for years at a loss. Moreover, those who do get lucky sometimes hire third-party workers to work on their behalf, outsourcing their risk and increasing socioeconomic inequality within the cooperative. Finally, although mining cooperatives operate with the state's blessing, they pay minimal royalties and no taxes while also failing to comply with environmental and labor standards. For all these reasons, Bolivians often describe cooperative miners as plunderers, bloodsuckers, and thieves. This paradoxical positioning, excuse me. So this paradoxical positioning makes them an interesting group of people from which to consider the conflict between discourses of sustainability and practices of resource extraction. Methodologically, I'm drawing on 18 months of fieldwork in Bolivia, half of which was spent conducting ethnographic research with cooperative tin miners in the towns of Yayagua and Uncia in the region of northern Potosí. So this is Bolivia, and this red part here is the department or state of Potosí, and the part I worked in is this part up here, which is called northern Potosí. And this region of northern Potosí is known throughout Bolivia for the strength of its ayllus, which are indigenous territorial communities. They exist throughout the Andean highlands, but only in northern Potosí have they remained consistently active throughout 500 years of colonial and republican rule. So in this close-up map, you can see all these dotted lines are dividing the different ayllus from each other. So you can see that the ayllus basically cover the entire territory of northern Potosí. The towns of Yayagua and Uncia, which is where I worked, are located on either side of the Juan del Valle mountain, which is this red triangle here. Tin mined from this mountain, the Juan del Valle mountain, floated Bolivia's national economy from 1899 to 1985. For the majority of that time, Yayagua and Uncia were home to some of the most militant labor unions in the world. But in 1985, economic restructuring resulted in the closure of the State Mining Corporation. And since then, Yayagua and Uncia have instead been home to 7 mining cooperatives that collectively have around 2,000 members. They are part of a nationwide wave of mining cooperatives created in the late 1980s, which today incorporate nearly 200,000 people. And this photograph is taken from the top of the Juan del Valle mountain looking down on Yayagua, and you can see it looks very picturesque and beautiful, but these large beige hills around here are actually huge mountains of slag or rocks discarded over a century's worth of mining. So these slag heaps extend far beyond what you can see in this picture, and then this is what they look like on the ground. So as a participant, observer, and interviewer working in this region, I regularly accompanied cooperative miners in their underground work, crawling through tunnels so narrow it was impossible to turn our helmeted heads sideways. I also spent time with cooperative miners in their homes, on their family farms, in political meetings, and I even visited them in prison. When I was not in Yayago, I was traveling throughout the Bolivian highlands and valleys, conducting interviews with policymakers, geologists, labor unionists, and environmental activists, and working in public and private archives. And I hope you'll get a sense of the texture of some of these places in this second section, part 2, findings. I'm going to switch into a little bit more of a storytelling mode here, just to warn you. In early March 2017, I joined Egberto, the 52-year-old cooperative miner pictured here, for a full day of labor in the Juan del Valle mountain. We spent much of the morning on our hands and knees in a tunnel that had recently been dynamited. Our task was to separate the freshly dislodged rocks into 2 piles, those that contained tin ore and those that did not. Egberto reached around my leg to show me what to look for. "This is a good one," he said, dropping the rock into my hand. It was surprisingly heavy and had a visibly thick line of black ore on one side. "It's at least 55 or 60% tin," Egberto said approvingly. "But this one," he showed me another rock for comparison, "is less than 30% tin. It's cara," he said, chuckling a little. Cara is the Quechua word for bald or naked, but it's also a derogatory term for non-indigenous Bolivians, whose paler skin and proximity to foreign powers have left them culturally naked. In the Cara rock, the black streak was lighter with an almost orange-red hue. This rock was stannite, a tin sulfide that makes the water inside the mine run orange. Egberto and his companions avoid this kind of low-grade rock underground as much as they might avoid a Cara Bolivian on the surface. So in this section of the presentation, I'll be exploring the relationship between the historical production of the mine as a 3-dimensional environment, the materiality of the resource tin, and the production of identities through labor processes. So with that in mind, I'm going to circle back to the economic and geological histories of this mine, and will gradually bring us up to the present, returning to Egberto's subterranean stories with a set of historical explanations. When Bolivian prospector Simón y Patiño, pictured here on the left, discovered a massive vein of black ore in his tiny mining concession in the Juan del Valle mountain in 1899, he apocryphally whispered to himself over and over while waiting for the laboratory results, "Que no sea plata, que no sea plata, please don't let it be silver." Although silver had been the backbone of Bolivia's colonial and republican economy for the previous 400 years, Patiño was hoping for tin. At the turn of the 20th century, this ancient metal was newly valuable in the industrializing North. Suddenly, it was needed in bearing metal, in dye fixatives, in weapons production, and, most importantly, in the canning industry. Unlike most metals, tin does not oxidize when exposed to air or water, and it was needed to package food for urbanizing populations and armed forces. The whole world was on the hunt for tin. In celebration of the modernizing promise of his tin mine, Patiño named its most important section Siglo XX, or 20th century. Well into the 21st century, the name Siglo XX rings strangely anachronistic, but it's still attached to the region's largest mining cooperative, the local university, the richest mine shaft, and the section of town that was once worker housing. The name also suits the metal, which was such a fundamental ingredient of 20th century capitalism. Now, geologically speaking, the Juan del Valle mountain is actually more like 2 mountains, one inside the other, each with its own history. This was explained to me by Ruben, a geologist from Yayagua. And this is a picture of Ruben here, and this is a picture that he drew of the mountain. So he explained that this outer layer of the mountain is sedimentary rock, while the interior is called a stock that was formed from an igneous intrusive, which is basically means that it was formed of magma that cooled underground. This red shape over here is also a depiction of the stock, which is kind of like the heart of the Juan del Valle mountain. According to Rubin, the stock is also like a nursery for tin. The metallic veins in the stock are made up predominantly of cassiterite, which is the most valuable tin compound, also known as stannic oxide. Cassiterite is relatively pure and has only to be shaken loose from its surrounding rock before it can be sent to the smelter. In the sedimentary rock, however, as it transitions from the stock to the sedimentary rock, the mineral content of the veins changes from cassiterite to stannite, a sparkly but worthless tin sulfide. Stannite must be concentrated chemically before smelting, and usually the yields are lower. In short, inside the sedimentary rock is where you'll find the kara stones that Egberto and others avoid when they're working underground. Rubin also gave me this geological map to see what this distinction between the stock and the sedimentary rock looks like in cross-section. Like most underground mines, the Juan del Valle mountain is divided into horizontal slices, each about 30 meters high, that start from the peak, or level 0. The lowest workable level is 800 meters down from the peak, or level 800. Below that, there's just too much water, even with multiple pumps. The main mine shaft enters more or less right in the middle, at level 412. After walking about a mile inwards, miners can get elevators to go either up or down, although to be honest, these elevators are about a century old, so many miners prefer to reduce their risk by climbing dozens of ladders instead. Tin-rich cassiterite can be found mostly in the lowest levels, from level 412 all the way down across the whole mountain. In these lower regions, the stock, which is that hardened magma that supported the formation of cassiterite, is at its thickest. Today, there are 4 cooperatives that work underground. The largest one is called Siglo XX, or 20th century, and it holds all of this volume below level 412 across the whole mountain. And again, this is where the tin deposit is the richest, where there's still the most cassiterite left. 3 cooperatives share the upper levels of the mountain, where the tin is mostly found in stannite. Not only do they make less money than their companions in the cooperative below, but miners in these upper level cooperatives are also exposed to more harms, since they have to use more chemicals to process their ore. So obviously this arrangement is inequitable. How it ended up this way is not just a matter of geology. When Simón y Patiño began processing tin in his mine in the Juan del Valle mountain at the turn of the 20th century, he was exploiting pure cassiterite. He built a railroad to move his ore as fast as possible. But the railroad workers, who arrived mostly from Chile and Argentina, shared their knowledge of Marxist and Trotskyist political theory with the Bolivian tin miners. Under their tutelage, Patiño's workforce quickly became the center of the national labor movement. Importantly, the great union leaders of this era were all underground miners. These workers developed a reputation for bravery that linked their daily risks underground to their willingness to take political risks on the surface. This underground workforce was almost entirely male. But this should not be taken to mean that women did not work in Patiño's mine. Hundreds of women were employed on the surface, but they worked almost always as pairis, which was a job that involved separating by hand rocks that contained cassiterite from those that contained only stannite. So for example, this is an employee file of a woman who was hired at age 17 in 1928 to work as a pairi. But the subsoil was marked as a male space, and the surface was where the women worked. And this division continues today, as male miners still commonly assert that metallic veins disappear when a woman shows up because Pachamama grows jealous. In a similar way, in the early 1900s, a link was also formed between the tin mines and mestizaje, which is the ideal of racial mixing upon which a unified Bolivian nation was imagined in the early 20th century. Patiño hired workers almost exclusively from the Cochabamba valleys, rather than the immediate vicinities of the mine, which is where all those ayllus are in northern Potosí, all those indigenous territories. And just to show you, here's an example of an employee file from this era, from 1927. And you can see that his birthplace was marked as Cochabamba, which is a very long way from the mines. So most of these workers from Cochabamba were technically indigenous, but they were Quechua speakers, and they had been integrated into the wage labor force for generations, and were not considered indigenous in the same way as the Aymara-speaking Ayu members. The Quechua-speaking tin miners formed the vanguard of Bolivia's 1952 national revolution, and they came to stand in for a dream of mestizaje, in which indigenous people could be transformed into citizens through separation from land, family, and language. So mestizaje was about cultural whitening rather than literal racial mixing, and the grime of the mines proved an ironic whitening agent. The 1952 National Revolution resulted not only in the expropriation of Patino's mines for the state, but also in the legal reclassification of all Bolivians as racially mestizo. That meant that a country that had been divided on racial lines became officially a country divided on class lines. Most importantly, for my purposes, the deep subsoil of the tin mines was associated with this nation-building mestizaje, while the surface level land of the Ayus was not. Today, every mining town across the highlands, and there are a lot of them, has a statue of a brawny, shirtless miner wielding a gun in one hand and a drill in the other. This is Yayagua's version of that statue. Here's the gun and here's the drill. These are the two tools of Bolivia's imagined masculine mestizo nationalism. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that regional geology, which is the materiality of the resource, and economic and national histories worked to construct Bolivia's subterranean as a fundamentally nationalist, masculine, and mestizo space. But this dream of national unity rested on a foundation of cassiterite, an ore that wouldn't last forever. In Yayagua today, the word that cooperative miners most frequently use to describe the Juan del Valle mountain is agotada, which means exhausted or used up. Occasionally, miners also use the word to describe themselves, or more specifically their lungs, which weaken after years underground. But neither the mountain nor the people have experienced this exhaustion in equal measure. The following stories will illustrate how the material exhaustion of this three-dimensional environment has shaped individual identities, which are divided along race and gendered lines. One afternoon in February 2016, Clemente, a 36-year-old leader of a mining cooperative in Yayagua, this is him here, invited me to ride up to the peak of the Juan del Valle mountain on his motorcycle. From there, he promised I would be able to see the lands of the Ayu Chulpa, where he had been born and raised. Although Clemente's village was only a few hours' walk from Yayagua, few residents became miners. My father was of the generation that was scared of the mine, Clemente commented, and there was a lot of discrimination back then, you know. Not just anyone could work in the mines. They didn't hire from the area. So I've already explained that Patino, who was the private mine owner from the early 20th century, rarely hired workers from the Ayus. But here I'm highlighting that this was also true of the State Mining Corporation that replaced Patino after 1952. The National Revolution of 1952 expropriated the mines, but had little impact on the socio-spatial division between the mines and the Ayus. Ironically, it was the exhaustion of the mine and the closure of the state corporation that fully pierced this barrier. When the mine was officially shut down in 1985, the laid-off miners were granted the right to continue exploiting the nearly empty mountain on their own. These miners enlisted the help of migrants from the Ayus. Like many indigenous highlanders of his generation, Clemente's father, the father the guy I was just talking about, joined a cooperative when it was formed. When he died, Clemente took his place at age 16. But Clemente discovered a penchant for bookkeeping and quickly began taking on leadership roles in the cooperative, a feat that he managed while returning to tend to his land on a weekly basis. And this is actually a picture of a potato harvest I went to with him when he returned home one weekend from going from the mines to the fields every weekend, basically. As Clemente's story highlights, IU members have been integrated into mining cooperatives since 1985. In doing so, they have also changed the internal divisions of space and labor inside and outside the mountain. Now remember that mining cooperatives are not cooperatives in the normal sense. They don't redistribute profits or expenses across the cooperative as a whole, but they do redistribute wealth within much smaller labor units called cuadrillas or work gangs, each of which owns a work area called a paraje, but you don't need to remember either of those words. Indeed, the entire volume of this mountain is carved up into hundreds of these work areas, each one of which is owned by work gangs that might consist of anywhere between 2 and 15 workers. So you remember this cross-section of the mountain and the division between the 4 cooperatives. Well, in practice, this is actually more like what it looks like underground, how the underground is divided up into hundreds of these little work areas. And these work areas aren't consistent in size or shape because they follow the veins of ore rather than geological maps. But this image gives you a sense of how they disrupt the clear divisions between the 4 mining cooperatives. And within each of these work areas, operations actually look something like a family farm more than a cooperative. The work gang members are very often related to each other. Nephews help out uncles, sons join their fathers, occasionally husbands and wives work together. And as an example, these are 3 brothers who've been working together for decades. I think of this as vertical family farming. And to see how this works and interacts with the unevenly exhausted geology of the mine, I'm going to return to Egberto, who's the miner I started this section with, and his work gang. This is Egberto again. Remember him, he's 52 and grew up in an IU called Caracha, which is right outside of Miragua. Like Clemente's father, Egberto began working in the cooperative soon after their formation in the early 1990s. Egberto now works underground with his 30-year-old nephew, who's also from Caracha, this is him here, and his 46-year-old cousin Romalda over here. Romalda is one of only about 10 women who work underground in the entire mountain, a right that she inherited when her husband abandoned her some 10 years ago. Membership within a cooperative is hereditary, and it usually goes to the eldest son, but Romalda had argued that her sons were too young. In the end, the only reason she was accepted was because of her familial relationship with Egberto. It's broadly the case that newcomers to the mine have a hard time finding a work site without a family connection, since all the major veins have already been claimed. In these ways, relations of kin, which stretch out across the lands of the IUs, are increasingly mediating access to the material remains of the underground. But Romalda is still something of a boundary crosser and an interesting figure to think with. In her above-ground life, she wears the traditional clothing of urban indigenous women, as you can see here. Underground, however, she wears men's work clothing, which are rubber boots, jeans, long-sleeve shirts, and of course, helmet and lamp. Romalda frequently jokes that she transforms herself every morning when she changes clothes. Because of this transformation, Romalda is considered a cooperative miner rather than a cooperative pairi, which is that word that specifically refers to women who work in the above-ground areas of the mine. And these words really matter, as Romalda reminds me frequently. She's not a pairi. But the very hierarchical distinction between miners and pairis emphasizes the gendered dimensions of the 2 realms, the above ground and the below ground. And this isn't just a gender distinction. Becoming more like a man also means becoming more like a mestizo, since only indigenous women have recognizably distinct clothing. These 2 categories basically always work together. Generally speaking, labor within a work gang is distributed relatively equally across all members to ensure that no one is responsible for the most onerous tasks on a daily basis. That means in a work gang of 3, for example, one member will operate the air compressor, which is this big machine here, to send air down to his 2 companions handling the pneumatic drill deep underground. One of these will be holding the drill while the other one directs the tip into the rock, as you can sort of see in this picture. And the next day, the three will rotate their jobs. And this rotational approach is actually inherited from the indigenous Ayus. It's what they do for all of their labor practices on the Ayus. But this arrangement is modified when there's a woman in the gang. Just like most of the women who work underground, Romalda over here spends much of her day washing rocks to determine which ones have enough ore to justify hauling them to the surface. This task is often assigned to women because it is deemed less physically strenuous than drilling, planting dynamite, or heaving sacks of overburden. So as we're talking, Romalda pauses to show me her hands, which are puckered, peeling, and splitting open from the cold, acidic water. You can always recognize miners from their hands, Romalda tells me, plunging hers back into the basin. Yet her hands are specifically those of a woman miner. Remember that distinction between cassiterite and stannite? Stannite is a tin sulfide. When rocks with high sulfide content are exposed to water and oxygen, they release hydrogen ions that substantially lower water's pH. This is called acid mine drainage, and it's common to mining sites around the world. But in this mine, the water becomes more acidic the more the miners exploit stannite veins. With the exhaustion of cassiterite deposits, exploiting stannite is precisely what many miners are forced to do. And since women are more likely to spend their days with their hands in the water, they are the ones who bear the brunt of this geological exhaustion. And this is not the only way women bear this geological burden. Nearly a year earlier, I had spoken with a doctor in the local hospital who mounted 3 X-rays of lungs with various stages of silicosis, or black lung, for me to examine. Scarring from silica dust showed up like a thickening mist, gradually turning the rib cages opaque. I asked the doctor if he had any X-rays of women's lungs. He shook his head and informed me that women are not susceptible to silicosis. At first, he said that this is because women do not do any drilling, which is the task that generates the most dust. But when I informed him that I personally knew several women who had been drilling for decades, but who could not convince his hospital staff to X-ray their lungs, he suggested that women have stronger bodies that fight against the impurities of silica. Apparently, scarred lungs are an attribute of real miners that women are not quite permitted to attain. Once again, the materiality of the underground interacts differently with different bodies, or at least is perceived to act differently in consequential ways. So what I've been trying to shed light on with all these stories is that mining cooperatives have emerged with socially differentiated identities in relation to the material worlds in which they work. Encrusted with 20th century meanings of masculinity, mestizaje, and modernization, and now mined with rotational family labor practices from the Ayus, this three-dimensional environment shapes cooperative miners' bodies, internal hierarchies, and their political aspirations. And that brings me to the third and final section of the talk, conclusions. So as I said at the beginning, I study mining cooperatives in relationship to the tense coexistence of resource extraction and plurinationalism. And plurinationalism, to recall, was supposed to herald a new era of environmental sustainability in Bolivia. And this tension is inadvertently illustrated in this billboard, which uses 18th century indigenous revolutionary Tupac Katari alongside the former president Evo Morales to advertise Bolivia's first satellite, which is also called Tupac Katari. And this satellite was actually paid for with rents from subterranean natural resource extraction. So it's an ironic combination of indigenous politics and resource extraction. So it's well documented that rampant extraction continues to dispossess indigenous peoples, thus violating the basic principle of plurinationalism. My work examines why this is happening, and particularly why people involved in pushing for resource extraction continue to do so, even when it's not that economically beneficial for them. I show how the Bolivian subsoil has been historically produced as a fundamentally masculine, mestizo, and nationalist space, and how miners' interests are produced in daily communion with its history and its materiality. Only later are these interests translated to political arenas on the surface. And indeed, cooperative miners are very influential figures in surface-level political arenas. They are members of parliament and senators. They sit on the board of the state mining corporation, and they are involved in writing new mining laws. And what you can see here in this picture is the former president, Evo Morales, who frequently made appearances at meetings of cooperative miners. And when he did so, he often wore this burlap backpack, which is called a caparina, and it's a symbol of cooperative mining. So by wearing it, he was sort of symbolizing his allegiance with cooperative miners. Finally, when their demands are not met, cooperative miners are more than willing to march in the streets with dynamite and to shut off major transportation arteries. The threat of such violent protests often cows policymakers into accepting miners' demands. Frankly, cooperative miners scare people. This fear was palpable in August 2016 when miners from across the country erected a roadblock on a highway just outside of La Paz to protest changes to the cooperative law. This run-of-the-mill roadblock spiraled out of control when the Deputy Minister of the Interior showed up to negotiate. Instead of negotiating, cooperative miners took him hostage, beat him to death, and left his body on the road. One cooperative miner told me later that the guns they had taken to the roadblock were ones their grandfathers had used in the Chaco War, which is credited with igniting Bolivia's national spirit in the 1930s. They have the spit of the nation on them, he told me about the guns. This kind of logical reasoning, wherein indigenous miners use nationalist guns to fight for the right to exploit exhausted tin mines, has been made possible by the production of the subsoil as a nationalist space through labor politics and their reenactments. These are the histories I excavated today. So I hope I have made clear the work that can be done with the conceptual triad of resource materiality, three-dimensional space, and the production of identity. But to close my talk today, I want to introduce you very briefly to my new project, which uses this same set of analytics to consider a global sustainability puzzle. This is a picture of an iconic mountain in Bolivia known as Mount Illimani. Below the mountain, as you can see here, is the country's capital city of La Paz, which has a metropolitan population of over 2 million residents. And almost all of these people rely on a combination of rainwater and glacial melt from Mount Illimani for fresh water. So this is a huge problem because the glaciers on Illimani have been shrinking annually with climate change. It's challenging to find a solution to this problem in a city where groundwater aquifers are so far below the surface. The Bolivian public, therefore, was outraged in 2016 when a report was published revealing that 8 different cooperatives were mining for tin in the base of Mount Illimani. So you can see this is Mount Illimani from above, and these are the different areas that cooperative miners were working in. Mining not only pollutes surface water, but it also speeds the rate of glacial retreat. Bolivian commentators, however, grew especially angry when it was revealed that several of these mining cooperatives were not working alone, but in partnership with a Chinese company known as Yunnan Tin. To contextualize this still a bit further, there's an incredible amount of anxious debate across Latin America right now about the role of China in funding and fueling demand for resource extraction. Some people in Bolivia call Chinese investment South-South cooperation, but others refer to it as a new imperialism, since most Latin American minerals end up in commodities produced in Chinese factories. In this case, the fact that mining cooperatives were not only operating within a mountain of symbolic and literal life-giving importance, but also doing so with Chinese financing was infuriating for most residents of La Paz. But here the story grows even more complicated because the reason China has such an interest in tin mining is that tin is an essential ingredient in the growing green energy economy. For example, tin is used in lead-acid batteries, lithium-ion batteries, and heat-resistant glass. This creates a double bind for La Paz and Bolivians more generally. La Paz is water-stressed primarily because of fossil fuel-driven climate change, and tin is one of many metals necessary to transition away from fossil fuel-based economies. And yet mining tin in a more localized and direct way also exacerbates urban water scarcity. So in this context, my new project aims to explore the water mining green energy nexus in Latin America. La Paz is my primary case study where I'm exploring how resource nationalisms like the ones I've been discussing today are being resuscitated in the context of green energy rushes. However, I'm also in the process of building out a comparative collaborative project with several other researchers and institutions across Latin America. The overarching goal of this collective project is to understand how supposedly green mining ventures are reworking older imperial dynamics and national identities, often with less than green outcomes. Put together, my former and current projects show how paying attention to the conceptual triad of resource materiality, three-dimensional environments, and identity formation has the potential to breathe new meaning into notions of global geopolitics. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming out today. I really appreciate having the chance to speak with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, we say thank you. And to the time, the floor is open. Everyone ask any questions to the Dr. Martin. Anyone? Okay. Can I have no need a microphone there. The voice will be clear. There's so many recording systems right now, surrounding everyone.
Okay, thanks for your presentation. I enjoyed it. You have described the world, so I would like to know what's the relationship between describing the world and changing the world. Are you interested in just describing the world, or you're trying to affect the reality? I'm interested in it. So please share your opinion.
So the question is, oh, you guys just disappeared. Oh, am I just describing it, or am I describing how it's being changed, or am I personally trying to change it? Well, I guess I'm describing it in a process of continuous change. So I'm thinking about how the geology of the mountain was initially, like before mining began, but then also how it's been continuously changing over the course of the last 100 years, and how those changes are continuously transforming different people's relationships with it and different people's bodies. So it never stops changing. It's always in a process of transitioning, and so the meanings attached to it are always in a process of changing too. But I'm not sure if you're asking if I'm also thinking about how to fix the problem. Is that part of the question?
Is that the questions?
Yes. She can listen, or
She listen to you, confirm your questions.
My question?
Yes.
My question is, actually, you conducted research in Bolivia, right? And then you describe what happened there, right? Then you publish your paper. And does it mean you are describing some realities, or you are trying to change the situation?
Oh, yeah. So what am I doing as okay. Yeah, no, I'm working in partnership with a lot of different organizations in Bolivia. So some of those organizations are the local university in La Paz, but also the Federation of Cooperative Miners in Yayagua, and at the national level. I'm in close conversation, especially with the women, so the women who are the cooperative miners themselves at the national level and the local level, and trying to think about solutions to make mining less dangerous, but also to transition away from mining. So definitely this is a conversation that I'm very much involved in, that's ongoing. Every time I go back to Bolivia, I'm in new conversations with new organizations about how to translate this reality into change, how to make it better for people.
So you have many channels, and one of it is academic work, is that right? You conduct research and you publish your paper, but you have many other channels to affect your research. Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's okay?
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, the Dr. Lo and then the Professor Lo, please. Professor Lo, please.
Hello again. Just kind of my curiosity that how and have climate change affect the mining industry over there?
How does climate change affect it?
The climate change.
How or have climate change affected the mining industry or the behavior or anything over there? Yes, or to your understanding?
Yeah. It's actually, climate change has caused a huge increase in mining, not just because of the last dynamics I was talking about the green energy economy, so that's part of it, but the more immediate problem is that it's a lot harder to farm than compared to how it used to be, because there isn't as much water in these rural areas. And so a lot of the people who were relying 100% on agriculture, small-scale agriculture, are now doing agriculture and mining, which is why they call themselves agricultural miners. So there's just been this huge influx of people into the mining sector, just as a kind of a way to diversify their family economies, because it's no longer sustainable to just rely on farming alone. With the kind of water that they have. Yeah, so that's the main way that it's increased. And then, of course, the more they mine, the harder it is to go back to agriculture, because the water is becoming continuously more polluted with all of the mining that's happening in the area.
Okay, so in agriculture and mining industry, they are kind of competing for the water resources. Is that what you try to address?
Sorry, I can't.
So they compete for the waters, like from agriculture for the farmers and for the industry, for the mining industry. Are they competing for the water?
Yes, they're competing for water, exactly. Is that with the farmers and the small-scale miners are competing for water among themselves, but sometimes they're the same people. Is that the question? Sorry, there's a lot of background noise, so it's hard to hear the questions very well.
Okay, so they can decide, because they are the same people, so they can decide the water locations by themselves.
Say that last part again.
Yeah, so they can decide to allocate the water by themselves, because they are the same people. Who farm and also who do the mining industry.
They're the same people, exactly. So not all people are the same people, but a lot of them are. So like sometimes one family member will be a miner and then everybody else is farmers, but because they're getting money from both places, the competition is also like part of a collective household effort to just make enough money.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, and then Professor, and then Mariana, you want to ask some questions? No? Okay, Professor.
Hi, I'm here. I'm Suchi Jo. I'm actually appointed by Department of Geography and joint appointment by IPCS. So, many geographers, human geographers in geography departments are quite familiar with your theoretical approach. And here today I would like to address two questions for you. First one is related to methodology. The other is related to research position in future for Taiwan. And the first one, you talk about a little bit about the women miners in your talk, but because about the technology problem, I cannot hear quite clear. But as far as I know, all of the world in Taiwan, in the past, women are prohibited to get into the mining ore. So as a woman geographer, I would like to ask about the gender issues. When you're doing, the research in Bolivia as a female scholars, is there any kind of problem that, so you know my question? So that will be related to gender issues in doing geography in this kind of research. And the second one is, because we are really curious about why you are interested in Taiwan's position, but for further question, I will discuss with you in the second part of our interview. Here, because in your third part of presentation, you talk about the future research, and I'm really curious about your idea about Taiwan's research potentials if you come to Taiwan. In terms of the global, real matter politics, how can you position Taiwan to continue your research in the real matters for the world resource development? Because Taiwan is an IT company. So you mentioned about something related to China, but there's some potential. I'm curious about how do you conceptualize or position your future research if you take an opportunity to join our, here in NTU. Yes.
Okay, so those are two great questions. So first of all, with the gender question, yeah, gender is a huge focus of my research. And part of the reason I started working so much with women underground is because as a woman, I had a slightly difficult time at the beginning getting access to the underground because of the reasons that you're describing. This is not a world of women down there, but there are women. And so I met the women, they introduced me to the men who work underground. Gradually, I went underground a lot. So probably I would go underground once every couple of weeks, and it added up. And so I gradually got to know the men who worked down there as well as the women. And I learned a lot about gender underground precisely because who I was talking with and who I am and who I had access to. And I actually think that being a woman at the end of the day made my research richer in a certain sense. And I was able to get to different kinds of questions around the gendering of the underground, sort of the way space itself became a masculine space by spending so much time with women in their transition from the surface to the subsoil. So even though it was initially, and a lot of people said, you can't go working with minors, you're a woman, they're never going to let you do that. That was not my experience. And they also have a differentiation that women in general can go underground, they just can't work. It's women working that are the problem. So as long as I wasn't doing any mining myself, then it wasn't much. But it was definitely a process. And I spent a long time in the town getting to know people, so that helped too. Regarding your question of why Taiwan and how I intend to sort of build out my project from Taiwan, I think I'm really excited about the prospect of developing a sort of reflection on the global China in Latin America from a position that is not just in Latin America or in North America, but rather from the other side of the ocean, sort of thinking about these changing geopolitical dynamics between Latin America and Asia, and thinking about much longer term histories of those exchanges of knowledge, of technology, of resources. Because the way it's talked about in Latin America and in the US too, is that, China and Latin America had no relationship whatsoever until all of a sudden China started investing in Latin America maybe 20 years ago. Which is absolutely not true, especially when you think around exchanges of political philosophy and when you think around the technological transfers between the regions. And there's some really interesting stories that I've discovered. In terms of how to do it practically, just like being so far away, I have an idea about sort of developing the more the Yunnan focus, actually. I know this is in mainland China, not in Taiwan, but I would be closer, at least. And because Yunnan has the same hard rock pin formations as Bolivia, and that's the area that all these big mining companies are based in China. And so there actually has been like a very close connection geologically, but also economically between these two regions. So I would be developing out kind of the Asia connections more. Since I'm doing more collaborative research now in Latin America, I don't have to spend as much of my own time in Latin America gathering data. So I can rely more on my colleagues and collaborators, not just in Bolivia, starting in Bolivia now, but hopefully Mexico and Chile as well, to think about kind of building up more of a regional expertise that is focused sort of across a different hemisphere than research is usually focused across, because the conversation is always about North America and South America, but this would sort of be a different hemispheric approach that I'm actually very excited about exploring. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, anyone? Please, Sophia?
I previously was very into I was previously very into the mining situation in the Philippines, and our kind of narrative is that indigenous interests are indigenous people are always this is our native land, we can't be mining on it, and I feel like that's typically the discourse you get with this extractivism topic, indigenous people protesting the extraction of their natural resources, and then the government being well, we don't care about their interests. But in Bolivia, from what I understood, it seems to be more of they want to be incorporated into the decision-making process more than physically protecting their land. So I'm wondering if Bolivia is unique in this kind of situation, and if more decision-making power was given to the indigenous people, would the situation improve?
That's a really good question. Because absolutely, supposedly, Bolivia is supposed to be this incredible outlier amongst all the countries worldwide that has actually granted more decision-making power and more power in general to indigenous peoples. And definitely, the first few years that Morales was in power, it looked like the situation was going to improve. But then it didn't really continue that way, because the government just started doing all the same things that they said they weren't going to do, starting around 2011 in terms of resource extraction, building large-scale dams, building large-scale highways through indigenous territories, exactly the same pipelines, all the stuff that you hear about happening in indigenous territories in other parts of the world were also happening in Bolivia. And so in 2011, indigenous nations officially said that they no longer supported Evo Morales, even though he was himself indigenous. And so he has been out of power since 2019. So he only had the support of indigenous nations for the first half of the time he was in power. And yet everyone worldwide thinks that he was completely beloved by all indigenous peoples for the entire time he was in power. But it was a little bit more of what he said versus what he did was quite different. But yeah, that's a great question.
Any other questions for the students, from the students, please? You need the microphone? Okay. Introduce yourself.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. A bit related to Sophia's question, I was wondering about this movement, this third national state. Can you give us more details about this? And also, I wanted to know if you think that this trend about electing leftist presidents in Latin America, like we had back in Venezuela or in Ecuador, is it still going on in Bolivia? And if so, is it mostly because of indigenous or extraction, of this thing about extraction?
Yeah, Diane is from French. She is a master student here. Chris.
I didn't hear that last bit that was just said, but I heard your question. Oh. Okay. All right. Okay. So plurinationalism, this is something that indigenous peoples have been pushing for a very long time in Latin America. And the idea is basically normally when you think about a nation state, there's one state and one nation, and they match each other perfectly. But the idea here is that there's one state and then like a whole bunch of indigenous nations. And instead of the state controlling the indigenous nations, it's sort of like being transformed by the indigenous nations. So it's being like, the idea is that the indigenous nations transform the state from within. And this is like a pretty radical idea, actually. It sort of started by Ecuadorian indigenous activists in the 1980s, and it's a really beautiful and cool idea. And the Bolivian Constitution, if you ever get a chance to read it, is so cool, because it's just like all these gorgeous ideas about sort of respecting the earth and respecting indigenous peoples, like taking indigenous values and really putting them into the state. The question about whether this is sort of continuing today is really interesting too, because in 2019, there was what was called a coup against Evo Morales. And there's a lot of debate about whether it was supported by the US or how it happened exactly, if it was a coup or if it was just that he just resigned because there was a lot of public outrage against his being in power. And I was more, okay, so there were two things that were happening. One is that actually people were really unhappy with him. A lot of people were really unhappy with Evo from the left. The people who had been supportive of him were really unhappy with him. But then there were also a bunch of right-wing people who had never liked him, who used the opportunity of these people no longer supporting him to kind of go in and take power. So it turned into a coup, although it didn't start off with that way. And the right wing had power for almost a full year, exactly. But then they had democratic elections. And during that year was awful. I mean, just everything was terrible. But then they had elections and Morales's party was voted back into power. A different leader, but very much continuing the exact same line. He actually was Morales's economic advisor before. So very much the exact same line of resource extraction takes priority, but we're going to use the money made from resource extraction and invest it in social infrastructure. So definitely better than sending it off to a foreign country or to like the US or something, but not perfect. And so it's very much the same dynamic as it was before.
Okay, I think we still have the time. If the students want to ask the questions, you can come over back about 1 hour later. And then we should start over here because we have the second round of a job interview with the faculty members. So we take a 5 break and then we say thank you again for Dr. Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then we will get back here with the colleagues together to interview with you. Thank you. Okay.